Representation is one of those buzzwords you hear tossed around nowadays, along with diversity, equity, inclusion, all related but slightly different terms. Diversity means having many different types of people around. Inclusion means inviting in those different types of people in the first place. Equity means allocating different resources to each individual, who all have varying levels of ability, in order to ensure they all arrive at the same outcome. This is in contrast to equality, which means allocating the same resources to each individual and allowing them to compete based solely on their own ability, with no pre-existing advantages. Each of these ideas, when steel-manned, sounds like it might be good, but they all also have serious disadvantages that progressives tend to ignore, and you'll be called a bigot if you ask about them. But today I want to talk specifically about representation. What is representation? Well, the dictionary gives us two pretty good definitions right off the bat. The action of speaking or acting on behalf of someone, and the description or portrayal of someone or something in a particular way. Colloquially speaking, the first one sounds like political representation, and the second one sounds like representation in media or cultural representation or something. Representation is a word that's tossed around a lot nowadays, especially if you're in more progressive spaces, but it's also a word that most progressives would be hard-pressed to actually understand, in my opinion. An activist might claim that they want more black representation, or queer representation, in some specific space. Let's take political commentary as an example. If you were to point out the success of people like Zuby or Blair White, the progressive activist would immediately say, no, those people don't count. I've also seen people say, we need more female authors. No, Ayn Rand doesn't count. Well, why doesn't she? These examples aren't politically aligned with the progressive movement, being conservatives and libertarians. But why wouldn't Blair White fulfill the progressive demand for trans representation? If the progressive replied to you, they might just call you a bigot at this point. But if they replied, they would probably say, well, she's not politically trans. And what does that even mean? Why is that required for representation? Well, just because progressives don't know what the fuck they're talking about doesn't mean that I'm gonna stay mired in ignorance. Maybe a year and change ago, I bought Professor Hannah Pitkin's 1967 book, The Concept of Representation. It was on the reading list of the Lotus Eaters. I've only managed to get around to it recently though. As a professor at U of C Berkeley, Pitkin's magnum opus is probably this book, and having now read it, while it's certainly important, it's also really dry and tough to get through. Most of this video will be information from that book and my own insights after reading it. The earliest use of the word represent is the Latin representare, which means to make present what is otherwise absent, to represent a thing that was already present before. For example, if you draw a picture of a real house, that is a representation of that specific house. It is representing the house. The quality of the drawing is found in how accurately representative it is of reality. Therefore, to represent means to present again what is found in the world, generally a facsimile of the real thing. It was not initially used to describe people representing other people. By the Middle Ages, representare was used to describe the Pope and Cardinals of the Catholic Church, representing Christ and the Apostles in church literature. However, this didn't initially mean that the Pope and Cardinals were granted the agency of Christ and the Apostles. Rather, they were their embodiment. By the 13th century, the term was being used in France to refer to the personification of collective life. For example, if a community needed representation in court by an attorney, that attorney was called the community's representare. And by 1595, individual English knights noticed that they all had slightly different, but mostly similar petitions to bring before the king, and that they could present those petitions collectively in order to appear more powerful and authoritative. They began to have an awareness of what we would now call class consciousness, in that despite being knights from all over England, the fact that they were all summoned to Parliament to meet with the king over matters of state gave them a common cause. They began to view themselves as members of Parliament, having similar aligned interests. The first use of the word represent in English came in De Republica Anglorum from 1583, which Pitkin quotes, but I found the original online. In the second section, titled Of the Parliament and the Authority Thereof, Sir Thomas Smith writes, "The Parliament of England represents and has power of the whole realm, both the head and the body. For every Englishman is intended to be present, either in person or by procuration and attorney, of what preeminence, state, dignity, or quality he may be, from the prince to the lowest person of England, and the consent of the Parliament is taken to be every man's consent." Smith is accurately describing the liberal concept of political representation. Because the members of Parliament represent the various populations of England, when all members of Parliament meet, symbolically it is as if all of the people of England are meeting, regardless of their social class. And when Parliament makes a decision, it is as if all of England's people have decided, and therefore they all consent to it. However, this is before liberalism. John Locke wouldn't be born until 1632, 50 years later. This is because liberal political philosophy, before it was codified by Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, existed as an informal set of traditions organically developed in the UK. But that is a very deep topic for another time. The point is, it's around here in history where the word representation begins to be used to refer to people representing other people. Pitkin identifies 4 ways in which the word representation is used. She labels them formalistic, descriptive, symbolic, and substantive. Formalistic representation is what Pitkin also refers to as authorization. It is the power to be an agent and act in the place of something larger than just yourself. This view initially comes from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. In the modern day, we consider only elected positions to truly be politically representative, not unelected ones like dictators. However, Hobbes disagreed with this view. He believed that any leader, elected or otherwise, represented you whether you wanted him to or not. His logic was that other countries absolutely viewed your country in this way. The king of a kingdom is representative of that kingdom's power and authority. He is not simply a man, but he represents the kingdom's powers to establish a trade deal, or levy a tax, or raise an army, whatever it is. The king represents the executive power of a kingdom in the eyes of other kingdoms. So for Hobbes, he represented the commoners of that kingdom, even if those commoners didn't consent. There's an obvious question to ask Hobbes here, though. If somebody claims to represent you, why shouldn't you have a claim on what your representative does? This is where the philosophical justification for democracy began to take root, in the understanding that being represented by a leader means that leader's actions are symbolically your actions, and so you should have some say in them. The second view is descriptive representation. This is what progressives are generally talking about. Descriptive representation is primarily aesthetic, where being representative means looking like the population being represented. In media, when you see characters getting race swapped, or diversity getting shoehorned in where it makes no sense for the story, this is descriptive representation. John Adams mentioned this form of representation in his 1776 essay Thoughts on Government, and how it was actually important for democracy. The principal difficulty lies, and the greatest care should be employed, in constituting this representative assembly. It should be, in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. Though it may be in the interest of this assembly to do strict justice at all times, it should be an equal representation, or in other words, equal interest among the people that should have equal interest in it. As the map represents the actual land, a parliament should represent actual people. And here there's an obvious question to ask Adams too. How accurate should representation be? It is necessarily abstract. If you drew a map that was the same size of the area of land it represents, like a 1 kilometer squared sheet of paper to map out a 1 kilometer squared piece of land, you could theoretically create a perfect representation. But as the map gets smaller, the representation of the land necessarily becomes less accurate. Therefore, representative bodies are inherently weak to subversion through demands for more representation on the basis of accuracy. Additionally, a random sample of people may in fact represent a group, but representatives aren't chosen randomly. By the very nature of the job of being a ruler, representatives can never represent a group perfectly accurately. Descriptive representation came about as a result of asking Hobbes that question: if the leader represents us, why shouldn't we have a claim on his actions? Descriptive representation holds that leaders cannot represent populations if the leader doesn't know what it means to be a member of that population. But this view is still flawed. There is nothing in descriptive representation that demands the representative do what the represented want. For example, defund the police was a very popular policy position to take among black elected Democrats, even though your average black American generally doesn't support that policy. Their ethnic similarity did not mean aligned interests. Symbolic representation is the use of a symbol to present an idea anew, and symbols mean different things to different people. The pride flag means liberation and equal rights to the LGBTQ activist, and it means degeneracy and groomed kids to the religious traditionalist. The Gadsden flag means liberty for the libertarian and fascism for the progressive. These symbols are not actually these things, obviously. They are mythic representations of ideas that resonate within the observer on an emotional level. In fact, the only criteria for a symbolic representation is the emotional reaction of the observer in the moment. This means that symbolic representation cannot be rationally justified, but it can be conditioned through repeated social pressure. A great example of this is how, for a time in the late 2010s, Pepe the Frog and Whole Milk and the OK hand symbol were astroturfed to be Nazi symbols, which was basically just a 4chan troll op. Nonetheless, symbolic representation is essential for all forms of political power, whether we like the government or not. All political leaders, whether they're democratically elected or they're dictators, though the effect is stronger with dictators, become symbols of their movements and countries. They represent the ideas and peoples they claim to speak for. The expansionism of the 20th century was explicitly justified by being the true representative of populations currently out of control of the representer. Mussolini and Hitler spoke of uniting Italian and German peoples into one nation. Lenin and Stalin spoke of speaking for the interests of the worldwide working class. Many leaders from America and Britain post-World War II spoke about how the common people of the world yearn for freedom from their dictatorial governments and claimed to represent them in the name of the liberal project. These declarations stir common people to action and provide the moral justification for the current political order. The leader becomes the symbol of the office he holds. For the fourth version of representation, substantive representation, Pitkin finally arrives at the core problem. The three other formulations never achieve what people actually want when they claim they want to be represented. What people want out of representation is a representative who will act in their interest, and the scale of the situation doesn't change this demand. You vote for the leader of your country because you want him to implement policies you think will be good for you. You vote for the treasurer of your high school club, expecting that he's not going to loot the end-of-year trip fund for himself. Pitkin makes the claim, and she's correct here, that what formalistic, descriptive, and symbolic representation all lack is a moral obligation for the representer to act on behalf of the represented, as if the represented were themselves there, acting on behalf of themselves. A king or an emperor has no obligation to act in any specific way. Absolute monarchies had to fend off revolutions from liberals and socialists alike because they felt no reason to react to the desires of their people. A symbolified leader has no obligation to act in any specific way either. The claim that Hitler is the quintessential German or Mussolini the quintessential Italian didn't imbue these men with any obligations. And a person who aesthetically looks like you also has no obligation to act in any specific way. In what way does AOC represent the Latin community in America, given the massive difference in values between the hyper-progressive AOC and your average community and church-oriented Latin voter? In what way did Rishi Sunak represent leftists in the UK who happen to share the same skin color as him? It's here that Pitkin stumbles upon the formulation of the principal-agent problem. When a principal hires an agent to do a job, it sounds like a basic exchange. I pay you, you do a job for me. But it's actually not that simple. Both the principal and the agent have their own self-interest, and if those interests aren't aligned, the principal has to pay the agent not only enough money for the job itself, but also enough money for the agent to disregard his own self-interest and perform the principal's interest instead. Also, being an agent is a position of power, as it comes with access to the principal, and so the agent must also be incentivized, either through aligned interest or additional reward, to not betray the principal to a competing principal. Additionally, the agent necessarily has more information about what he's hired to do than the principal does, meaning that the principal has to trust that the agent is actually doing what he claims, at least until the negative consequences of a lying agent begin to roll in and can no longer be ignored. A good example of this is, imagine a king who's asleep at night, and there are 2 guards on night shift watching the door. The king has to make sure that he's paid those guards well enough that they're not only guarding him, but that they're also not leaking information to his enemies, or they're not going to turn on him if revolutionaries show up. Pitkin admits that substantive representation is necessarily vague. It has something to do with satisfying the represented, but it can't really be nailed down. This is because sometimes what people claim they want is not actually what they want. This is called revealed preference theory, an idea coined by the economist Paul Anthony Samuelson in 1936. He believed that regardless of what people tell you, what people do is a more accurate descriptor of what they want. Let's say that you claim to prefer ketchup over mustard on your hot dog, but then you order a hot dog with mustard instead of ketchup on it. Your actual choice, mustard, is a more accurate descriptor of your preference than what you outwardly claim, ketchup. Samuelson's insight proved invaluable beyond economics. For example, people might publicly claim to be voting for party or candidate A due to peer pressure or something, but in the privacy of the voting booth, they vote for party or candidate B instead. This is why polling tends to get less accurate as political radicalization increases. Additionally, sometimes what people want is not actually in their best interest. This one is probably best described as the paradox of hedonism, which is a far older idea than the previous one. There are some pretty obvious examples here. Let's say a drug addict wants drugs. If you are the representative of the drug addict, do you give him drugs or not? If you're following his commands and you do as he consents, you give him the drugs. But if you're doing what's good for him, what's in his interest, then you don't give him the drugs. The word represent is used to describe both doing what the represented wants done and also doing what's in the represented's best interest. So both of these choices can claim to be representative. Pitkin describes this as the interests of the population being at odds with the wishes of the population, a phenomenon which she calls the mandate independence controversy. The question asked is, how much freedom should a political representative actually have? Should a representative simply do what his constituents want and be bound by mandates from them, or should he be free to act as best as he thinks in pursuit of their welfare? It's actually a tough question. I think most people default to the former option at first glance. You elect someone to do X, they have a mandate to do X from the community, you expect them to do X while they're in office? If they come back later and say, yeah, you know what, I decided not to do X, most people would be outraged. Their congressman broke their promise. They were supposed to be our mouthpiece, our voice in the larger stage. That's a very common sentiment. But what happens if X is actually a bad idea? Here's a simple example. What if the people who live in a small town that's kept alive by a coal mine want the federal government to put tariffs or bans on foreign coal to protect their local business? Okay, fair enough. They vote for a rep who wants the same thing, they pass legislation, they get what they want. But what if that then actually destroys the local economy of the town, because the country in question was actually a net exporter of coal, and when they banned foreign coal, the other countries they exported to set up equivalent bans? The problem here is, what should representatives do when their constituents want something that is bad for them, and the representative understands this, but the constituents don't? Should the representative simply follow the command of his constituents and destroy them when the constituents are wrong? Or should he act against their stated preferences and instead act in their interest, even if it destroys his own career as a rep? In actuality, these two necessary parts of representation are inherently conflicting, and tilting too far in either direction makes the representer non-representative of the population. The only solution to this problem is a constant negotiation between the representer and his constituents, something that many people claim no longer happens in modern democracies, which are dominated by intra-party politics and whips and other pressures that disproportionately distracts the representer away from his constituents. For most of this video, we've been talking about political representation, because that is what Pitkin's book is about. But her analysis applies to any form of representation. If you want cultural representation, if you are, let's say, a black activist who wants there to be more black actors or black pop stars or black video game characters or whatever the fuck, all the same things you've spoken about today can be reformulated to fit the new circumstance. A black activist wants more black characters in video games and movies because they want their community to be represented positively in the wider culture. They want people outside of their group consuming that media to come away from it with a good feeling about the group, and they want people inside of the group consuming the media to come away from it with a good feeling about themselves. However, Pitkin's same objections apply. There's no reason to believe that any of these forms of representation would actually generate those feelings about the group in the audience. In this version of the problem, symbolic representation would turn a black character in a piece of media into a mythic symbol of the black community in real life. But there's nothing about simply being a symbol that would make the wider culture view the black community positively, as the character could simply be a negative symbol. Descriptive representation means a black character represents the black community solely on the basis of their shared skin color. But again, there's nothing in that that means the black character would make the wider culture view the black community positively. And since formalistic representation is simply a description of power in the political sense, in the cultural sense, it would be a direct demand that because the character is black, you will view him, and by extension, you will view the black community as positive, regardless of the character's actual actions in the story. Culturally speaking, substantive representation means a black character in a story who does represent the black community in real life does so in a positive light because he's a positive role model, because his character is positive itself, which is what progressives actually want when they say they want representation. However, the problem then becomes one of accuracy. If it's believable that that character would be in that situation and be that type of person, then great, no problem. But when you start to get, for example, black Vikings or black samurai, the fact that it's not accurate, and that accuracy has been sacrificed for presenting the real-life black community in a positive light, that breaks the representation, in the same way that politically, a representer no longer represents their constituents. You might be asking, hold on a minute, Dev, if this is all true, why doesn't it happen for white characters? The answer is that white characters generally aren't presented by the author of a work as representations of the white community. When a white character is presented in this way, and that is happening more and more often nowadays, this same critique applies. And realizing that, you should now understand why liberal colorblindness works. If black characters are conceptualized not as black characters, not as representatives of the black community, but simply as characters who happen to be black, and they are utilized appropriately for the story, all of the representation nonsense is sidestepped. It makes sense to have black people in a story taking place in a modern, multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan city. It doesn't make sense to have black Vikings, unless you're explicitly doing some goofy anti-historical fantasyland shit, which can be fun for its absurdity. This also applies to female representation, to gay representation, to trans representation, all of it. Progressives reject liberal colorblindness because it means that representation doesn't come with political power, and they want the power. Pitkin's analysis not only applies to political and cultural representation, but also representation in private institutions, like corporate boards or whatever else. Also in classrooms and universities, basically all forms of representation. But the same problem remains. Focusing on representation all but ensures that the goals of representation will never actually be achieved. It's like trying to hold on to sand by squeezing your fist too tightly. If you don't focus on race, you won't become more racist. And if you do, you will. Which is why the BLM people are rapidly approaching the rhetoric of the KKK in a lot of ways. We have all observed this in action. In gaming, in movies, in TV shows, in government, in private corporations, in schools. As all of these institutions began to focus on representation, a backlash of discrimination has only grown more powerful over time, as we've shifted away from the post-bigotry of the nifty 90s. And politically, calls to become more democratic over time, more inclusive, more representative, has paradoxically led to less democracy. I hope now you have at least some understanding of why this is all happening. Alright my friends, that about does it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're watching it on release, stick around in this channel because my editor Dave and I were going to be streaming some Space Marine 2 right after this video goes live, so drop by and say hi. I'll see you over there. Have a good one guys. I love you.